Hypocrisy not only blinds us to God, but others as well. Today, Pastor Lemming brings his next message from his series, Blessed.
Matthew chapter 5, and we continue in this series of messages entitled Blessed, looking at these 8 Beatitudes. Some say 9, but I'm including verse 10 and verse 11 together because they both deal with persecution. I'm going to read to you beginning in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And here's where we are today. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before them. A lot of people can quote some of the Beatitudes, or at least get an idea or have an idea of what they are supposed to be. But a lot of times we find ourselves, much like this man that was on the screen here a few moments ago, we're very hypocritical, we're very duplicitous. We say one thing and we do another. We are involved in certain actions, but our hearts aren't there, not committed in the same fashion. And today we're talking from this beatitude in verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. As we start today, let's just take a moment and let's be reminded that the Beatitudes are a little bit like a mountain, if you will. We live in a mountainous state. It's a little bit like a mountain. In the first 3, you're moving up the slope. You're poor in spirit, and you're mourn, and you're meek. You have strength that's under control. And what they remind us of is that we're spiritually bankrupt. We're broken in sin and over sin, and we're in need of self-restraint. But when you get to the 4th one, you're sort of at the pinnacle of the mountain. And in that 4th one, we're reminded that we have to truly hunger and thirst for righteousness. And when we do that, we'll be filled and satisfied. But then these next 3, one that we saw last week, one this week, and one next week. It's like coming down the other side of the hill. This is the outcome. When we hunger and thirst for righteousness, this will be the outcome of our lives. We will be merciful. We'll be pure in heart. We'll be peacemakers in this life. And so these 3 Beatitudes result from the filling of the righteousness of God that we were hungering and thirsting for. And consequently, we become people of mercy and purity. So what does it mean when he says, I want you to be pure in heart? I hope you'll listen carefully today, because this is a very tough one on all of us. It's been tough on me preparing. It'll be tough on all of us as we consider it together. But what does he mean when he talks about being pure in heart? You'll remember early on in the ministry of Jesus Christ that he was calling together his disciples, specifically the apostles. He had called Philip and Andrew and Peter and James. But on one occasion, he comes to Philip and he says, I want you to follow me. And Philip begins following Jesus, but he first goes and finds Nathanael. Remember that story? He goes and finds Nathanael, and he says, Nathanael, you've got to come see this one. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is the one that we've been longing for and we've been waiting for. And of course, Nathanael is like a lot of people. You know, sometimes he speaks before he thinks about what he's about to say. And Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? I mean, Nazareth is this little town. It's barely even in existence. It's hardly even there compared to many of the other places where the Messiah could come. He's going to come out of that insignificant little place called Nazareth. That's what he's thinking inside of himself. But he comes along with Philip. And when Jesus sees him coming, Jesus speaks to him and says that he had seen him under the tree and he already knew who he was. And of course, Nathanael is overcome with what Jesus knows about him before Jesus even knows him. But in the midst of all of this conversation that's going on, Jesus says about Nathanael that he is an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. He is an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. Now you have to think about this for a moment to understand everything that Jesus wants us to know. He's an Israelite. You remember Israel that's his name after it was changed from Jacob to Israel. And do you know the story of Jacob and his brother Esau and how Jacob ends up with the blessing and the birthright by using a deceitful means to take it away from his brother? And he's comparing him to Israel. He's an Israelite, one of those who in the past has been like his father, Jacob, who's now named Israel. He's been like those who are deceitful. But this one who's coming toward me, this man named Nathanael, that deceit is not in him. He is a man in whom is no deceit. Do you think it's deceitful when we stand and we sing songs about giving all to Jesus, but when we leave, we hold on to as much as we possibly can? Do you think it's deceitful when we say we love Jesus with all of our hearts, but we don't show up for church services and we never put our hands to the plow and go to work in his service? Do you think it's deceitful when we tell others that Jesus is the most important one in our lives? No one supersedes his priority in our lives, and yet we won't step forward and we won't follow him in believers' baptism, publicly confessing him before others? Do you think that's deceitful? Absolutely. That's deceitful. And when Jesus sees Nathanael coming at him, he says, here is an Israelite, not like the ones before, who have been deceitful in their hearts and in their lives, who have said one thing and done another, who have done some things but whose heart was not in it. He's not like many of those Israelites. Here is a man in whom there is no guile. There is no falsehood. There is no pretense. There is no mask. There is no costume that he's wearing. Here is a man who is genuine and who is sincere through and through. This word pure is used in a number of different contexts. It speaks of something that's been cleaned, like clothes that have been washed. Or it speaks of grain that has been winnowed and it's been sifted and the chaff has fallen away. It speaks of an army that's been purged of all discontented, fearful, unwilling, and inefficient soldiers, and they're left with only the most courageous of the men to fight. It speaks of metal that's been heated up to its molten state, and the alloy is taken off so that the metal is as pure as it can possibly be. One person defined this idea of pure this way. He said, this purity is an internal integrity that is expressed in outward behavior. Another said, and you're going to see the consistency of these definitions, it is a consistency between outward behavior and inward thought. Still another scholar defines it this way: it is an internal integrity that transparently manifests itself in outward behavior. In other words, to be somebody who was without deceit, to be somebody who is pure in heart, is somebody who's not just going through the motions of their Christianity, but who has a heart that is fully and wholly devoted to the Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, this beatitude that we're looking at today demands from us the most exacting spiritual self-examination. For us to look within our hearts and say, are we genuine? Are we sincere? Or are we merely going through the motion and our hearts are a million miles away? As a matter of fact, my mind has already drifted out of this service to what else I have to do the rest of the day. It's a little bit of what David was saying in Psalm 139, verses 23 to 24, when he said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." In other words, you can put on a front, and you can go through the motions, and you might convince many people, but you know in your heart that something is not right. You know in your heart that you're not doing it from the very depths of your being. And it elicits the kind of questions like these. Is our work done from motives of humility or from motives of pride? Is our service selfless or about self-recognition? Is our church attendance to meet God or to fulfill an obligation? Is our prayer or Bible reading from a desire to fellowship with God or to fulfill an obligation? Is our church giving done with the sincerest generosity, or do we just do what appeases our conscience so that we can feel like we don't have to live with that guilt because we haven't been participating? You understand what he says when he says the pure in heart? It is the willingness to let God probe our deepest motivations. And when we allow him to do that, inevitably we come back convicted. Because I want to tell you something that's true of every person on the planet, no matter how good a Christian they may be. Every one of us has a measure of hypocrisy in us. And oftentimes our hearts and our actions don't match up as they should. This idea of being pure in heart is calling for the kind of sincerity that goes to the very core of our being. This beatitude, to be pure in heart, is so that we'll be pure through and through. It's the type of introspection that moves the test of Christian character from observable actions alone to hidden inclinations. Let me say it again. This type of introspection moves the test of Christian character from observable actions alone to hidden inclinations. Lord, I want to be pure in heart. I want it to go to the very core of my being. I want there to be a sincerity and a genuineness that issues forth where I'm not covering up what is really going on in the inside, but what is going on the outside matches and measures up to what is going on in the inside. That there is that kind of sincerity, that kind of genuineness. Let's remember that the heart here speaks of the core of a person. It is the place where we think, we feel, and we determine our actions. It's the innermost part of a person where decisions are made and attitudes are formed and actions are contemplated. To be pure in heart is to be pure throughout. It amounts to an internal integrity that manifests itself in proper outward behavior. I grew up during a time when there was a lot of legalism, and you got a long list of things that you could and you couldn't do, and you checked it off. I did this, and I didn't do that, and I did this, and I didn't do that, and I did this, and I didn't do that. And the result of that was that we had a lot of people that were being conformed, but they weren't being transformed. Do you understand the difference? They were being like putty, shaped by this outward legalism, but there was never a change in their hearts that resulted in actions that demonstrated the depths of their love for Jesus Christ. There's an internal integrity that manifests itself in outward behavior. It denotes one who loves God with all his or her heart and serves with an undivided loyalty, and whose inward nature corresponds with his outward profession. Do you get the idea? What he's aiming at here is hypocrisy, duplicity, being deceitful at the core of our being, going through motions that have no heart that are involved, just doing what we think we're required to do, but really not being changed from the inside. I want you to keep your Bible here at Matthew chapter 5, and I want you to turn back with me to the book of Psalms, Psalm 24, because this beatitude comes out of Psalm 24, and you see the two sides of what Jesus is trying to say. And you'll see why in just a moment. The two sides of what Jesus was trying to say. Notice verses 3 and 4. He's talking about who can go up to Jerusalem and who can go up to the Temple Mount and who can go up to worship God. Verse 3, who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who may stand in his holy place? And notice, internal and external. He who has clean hands, that's external, and a pure heart, that's internal. Who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, that's external, nor sworn deceitfully, that's internal. Do you see that? The same thing is given to us in the book of James. You don't need to turn there, but chapter 4, verse 8, if you're making notes, James says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, that's external, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Internal and external, they match up. There isn't a duplicity. There isn't a deceitfulness. There is a genuineness, and there's a sincerity, and there's a reality to the spiritual life that we're living, that our heart is in it. Our heart is in it. We're not just going through the motions. There's an old television show that some of you will remember called Leave It to Beaver. Remember that show? Some of you don't know about that show. Trust me, you would do better to go watch Leave It to Beaver in black and white than to watch the shows that are on television today. But there was a character in the Leave It to Beaver show that everybody loved to hate. His name was Eddie Haskell. Remember Eddie? Eddie was always getting Wally and Beaver into trouble. And yet, whenever Mr. Cleaver, the father of Wally and Eddie would come, or Wally and Beaver would come into the room, inevitably Eddie would respond with some kind of a line that goes like this: hello, how are you today, Mr. Cleaver, sir? And you could hear the inflection of his voice. Mr. Cleaver was wise to Eddie. He already knew what Eddie was really like. But whenever he would leave the room, then Eddie would say something to Mr. Beaver that went like this: hey, what is your old man all bent out of shape for, Beaver? And he had this negative tone to his voice. He was one thing in the presence of Mr. Cleaver, and he was something else when he was away and with Beaver and with Wally alone. One thing that the Sermon on the Mount is seeking to do at this point is to expose our hypocrisy and cause us to cry out to God for deeper sincerity. That our Christianity goes beyond just the rituals or the routines that we go through, the habits that we've built, and it goes to the very core of our being so that we are a people who are pure in heart. By the way, when you become a person who is pure in heart, there is no problem with the actions that come from that, right? Right? If your heart is pure, your actions inevitably are going to match the purity of heart. This purity of heart is the very reverse. It's the very reverse of what Noah was dealing with in his day. Do you remember what Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 says about Noah and the day in which he was living? It says that every inclination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Every inclination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. I mean, no matter what they were doing externally, internally, it was all evil all the time. The inclinations of their heart, such that we could actually paraphrase this beatitude to go something like this: blessed is the person whose inclination is toward purity of heart and purity of action. And if you want to see the quintessential the quintessential example of what we're talking about, you only have to look at what group of religious people from the day of Jesus? The Pharisees. Because the Pharisees were fastidious about obeying all of the intricate commands and all of the oral traditions and making sure that outwardly they did everything they were supposed to do. But the result was that they were only going through routines and rituals, and they had no reality to their hearts. They had no reality to the love that they were to have for Jesus Christ. I want you to look with me for a moment back to Matthew, and I want you to go back with me to Matthew 23. And Jesus is excoriating the Pharisees, the religious people of the day. By the way, the Pharisees were some of the most respected people of the day. We look down on them. We don't think much of them because we have the whole picture of what they were really like. But in that day, in the first century when Jesus was living, people respected the Pharisees. They thought of them as being the most pious of the pious. They thought of them as being the most religious of the religious. I mean, that's the kind of people they viewed themselves. But Jesus comes and Jesus exposes them for what they are. Notice at verse 13 of chapter 23. He says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." What's the word? Hypocrites. Verse 14. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Verse 15, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Or down to verse 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Verse 25, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Verse 27, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Or verse 29, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." What do you think Jesus thinks about hypocrisy? What do you think Jesus thinks about the duplicity of our lives, where we have a public persona and we have a private one that doesn't match, that isn't the same? What do you think Jesus thinks when we go through the motions of our Christianity, but our hearts are far, far, far from Him? What do you think Jesus thinks about that? Go back to Matthew chapter 5 for a moment. And look what He does in the Sermon on the Mount. Look how He talks about there being a singleness, that there being no double-mindedness, that there is to be no hypocrisy and no duplicity, that we are to be from our hearts followers of Jesus. Notice verse 27. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" That's external. "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her." Where? In his heart, right? Are you with me? In his heart. Back up for a moment to verse 21. I skipped right over it to verse 21. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder.'" That's external. "And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of judgment." Do you see what Jesus is doing? Do y'all see what Jesus is doing? He's saying to the Pharisees who were probably listening into this conversation, this message that Jesus is delivering to His disciples, and He's saying, look, don't be like them. They go through the motions. They have all the right look. They dress the right way. Everything externally seems to be really good for them. But the reality is, at the core of their being, what does He later say about them? They are full of dead men's bones. They're whitewashed tombs. You know what they would do with tombs in those days? They would whitewash them. It not only made them look better, it identified them, because if you stepped on a dead body, even if it was in the ground, if you stepped on a dead body, you were instantly unclean, and you had to go through a process to become clean again to be able to go to the temple and worship. So they marked the tombs, but in the process of marking the tombs so you didn't wrongfully step on them, they made them beautiful. But he said, you're like these beautiful tombs. Everybody stops and says, wow. It's like going to Arlington Cemetery and seeing those rows after row after row after row of those headstones of those soldiers who have been buried there. I mean, it's awe-inspiring, isn't it? It's awe-inspiring when you see it. And seeing those tombs marked that way was an awe-inspiring sight. But he says the reality is, while the outward side of the tomb may look beautiful, what's on the inside is nothing more than dead men's bones. He says on another occasion, you're like a cup, and the outside of the cup is really clean. And I meant to bring a glass today to show you this. The outside of the cup is really clean. You ever had milk in a glass, a clear glass? And you drank it all up and you didn't wash it. You left it just sitting there and the milk sort of got milky. What do you call it? Yeah, the film on the inside of the glass. See, I have to have help with sermons. The film on the inside of the glass, you could wipe the outside of the glass all you want. Would you want to drink out of that glass? Let's just pour a Coke in there. That's a spiritual drink. Let's just pour a Coke in there and let's drink out of that. He said about the Pharisees and the religious people, you're like those who are clean on the outside, but you are dirty on the inside. You know what I'm talking about. These are the people, to give you an extreme example, these are the people who talk about how much they love God, and they'll come to church and sing the praises of God, and they'll look really good on Sunday and on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. They're surfing for pornography. Or they're lying. Or they're cheating. Or they're stealing. Or any other number of things. Outwardly, they look wonderful. Inwardly, they're as dirty can be. And Jesus says, if you're going to see God, you got to be somebody who's pure in heart, understanding that none of us will ever be as pure as we need to be. We are pure positionally before God. We have been made righteous in the righteousness of Jesus Christ, but practically all of us are a work in progress. And all of us need every day for God to be searching our hearts and exposing where we're dead men's bones, where we're dirty glasses on the inside.
Thanks for joining us today, and we hope you'll return next week to hear the second part of this message. If you would like more information about this message or Lewis Memorial Baptist Church, please feel free to contact us. We would love to hear how this ministry is helping you in your daily walk.